Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Before we begin, I want to remind you to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Join and engage in our growing international community. Now let's get to our story today, which is going back to the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Now this is something we have reported on extensively, though in the past few days we have been focusing on other issues. Now the last time we spoke to you about this conflict was on Wednesday, where we were discussing the bombing of a maternity ward in Mariupol. Now since last Wednesday, militarily and tactically speaking, not much has changed in this conflict. Russian soldiers, their convoys, and their offensive positions continue to be completely stalled. Russian air superiority has not been confirmed nor achieved as of this time in the conflict, despite desperate Russian attempts to do so. Since this war began, over 900 missiles have been fired in an attempt for Russia to create air dominance. Now, Russia continues to be completely stalled, and this has created a very dire civilian situation. Civilians in Ukraine are living through what is essentially a nightmare. They are in the dark, both in terms of literally speaking and in terms of information. They don't know what's going on, when they're going to be bombarded, when they're going to be attacked, or what is their future. Many of them are trying to leave the cities. However, this is not possible because humanitarian corridors have, as of thus far, besides one that is currently occurring outside of Mariupol, failed because of continued fighting. Many civilians are not able to leave. They are still stuck in the cities, seeking shelter in makeshift bomb shelters underneath the ground. Now, in addition to this, many residential and civilian buildings have been bombarded and targeted by Russian attacks. We are talking about schools, hospitals, and other civilian infrastructure. Now, the reality is while the civilians are not inside these buildings, and the vast majority have either become refugees and left Ukraine or are again seeking shelter underground, these buildings are extremely important to the economic development and stability of Ukraine after the war ends. And when they are destroyed, this is going to create even more problems for Ukraine. Bringing Russia's intent on the destruction of these buildings and the targeting of these buildings into question, if whether or not it's to destabilize Ukraine and cause long-term damage to the country. Now, in terms of refugees, 2.8 million people have fled Ukraine so far. This has become the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. The vast majority of these refugees have gone to Poland and other European countries, not knowing what their future is going to be like, having to say goodbye to their family members, and being left on their own. This situation is turning out to be one of the darkest in modern day history, and the world is watching. The conflict cannot continue this way. But there is some good news and some small glimmers of hope, at the very least diplomatically speaking. Now, as I've already mentioned, as we are talking right now, or as you're watching this video, a humanitarian corridor outside and leaving Mariupol, where the fighting has been the worst for civilians, where Russian bombardments have cut them off from food, water, medicine, and heat, and people have been dying. Our last report was covering a maternity bombing in the city of Mariupol, where a pregnant woman has died alongside the child that she was carrying. Now, that is dark, but a humanitarian corridor has been established, allowing civilians to leave the city of Mariupol and go to the city of Zaporizhzhia, which is more to the west. From Zaporizhzhia, these civilians will be able to enter western Ukraine and most likely eventually become refugees in Poland. Now, this is actually good news compared to their previous situation of being bombarded and not having basic human necessities available to them. It's estimated that 160 civilian cars are part of this convoy. And the reality is previous humanitarian corridors have failed. As soon as they've been opened up, fighting has broken out again, stopping civilians from being able to leave. This corridor, however, its ceasefire has persisted, allowing the civilians to actually flee to safety. That is good news. In addition to that, today, the fourth round of potential peace talks were held between high-ranking negotiators from the Ukrainian and Russian governments. Now, no major breakthrough was done today. However, a technical pause was taken and they will be meeting tomorrow. Now, that is a glimmer of hope. What a technical pause is when both parties need to take a moment to break and stop and go over each party's demands and see what can be agreed to. Now, both the Russian and Ukrainian sides and their negotiators have expressed hopefulness that this can actually result in some kind of concrete agreement, leading either to peace or at the very least a periodic ceasefire to allow for future diplomatic talks to be had. Now, the reality is the best solution to this conflict is creating some kind of peace agreement as soon as possible. And whatever is agreed to, at the very least, some fundamental principles need to be established from that peace agreement. Number one being primarily a ceasefire that leads to long-lasting peace. And in order for that to happen, there would have to be a full withdrawal of Russian soldiers. Now, finally, both parties would have to agree to ensure each other's security demands in order to prevent a future conflict from continuing or from happening years down the road. We don't want to find ourselves in this situation again. Ukraine doesn't, Russia doesn't, the Western world doesn't. This conflict has been extremely costly to everyone. Now, the vast majority of the cost has been taken by the Ukrainian civilians. But this conflict has also hurt Russians, the Russian soldiers, the Russian military, and generally speaking, the entire reputation of both. Before this conflict, Russian soldiers and the Russian military were feared as this great, technologically advanced, and very efficient force. However, they have demonstrated that that is not true. Keep in mind, Russia's military is larger and much more better equipped than Ukraine's. Despite this, they have met stiff resistance on the ground that has completely stalled their offensive efforts. Now, in addition to this, Russia has been accused of asking China for military equipment for the war in Ukraine. Russia denies this, stating that it has its own capabilities to carry out its military objectives. Though, as we can see on the tactical situation on the ground, that fundamentally isn't true. The Ukrainian resistance has been primarily through the Ukrainian military, but also through other civilian branches, such as the Territorial Defense Force or other civilian militias fighting the Russians. These Ukrainians have also been armed by Western weapons, which have assisted them in preventing Russia from asserting air superiority and also stop many Russian advances. However, the fighting still continues and the civilians are paying the toll. Not just in Ukraine, but the world over. As we've mentioned before, massive sanctions have been levied on Russia, creating shortages of important goods such as fuel, increasing prices all over the world. Pretty much everyone alive today is feeling some kind of, at the very least, minimum negative effect from this conflict. Those who are directly inside Ukraine are facing a monstrosity of a reality right now. Now, these peace talks today can hopefully be a glimmer of hope and a step in the right direction of ending this invasion. If that doesn't happen, what is going to occur is an eventual Russian occupation. Now, while the Ukrainian resistance is extremely brave and is fighting as well as it can, the reality is Russia is just a larger military force. It can eventually take over Ukraine and occupy the nation, but that is going to come at a massive cost to Russia and is just going to lead to an insurgency in Ukraine, which is going to be unsustainable, and Russia will eventually lose, causing even more deaths, civilian deaths, soldier deaths, the continuing of sanctions, and the economic damage that's associated with them. The longer this conflict occurs, the more it negatively affects all of us. Hopefully, these peace talks, which are planned to continue tomorrow, will produce, at least for now, some kind of ceasefire that will lead to a long-term peace. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you think I'm being too idealistic or if I'm being too positive. I do think that it's in the interest of both parties to come to some kind of peaceful agreement and end what has become one of the darkest episodes in contemporary history. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. I'll see you guys tomorrow.